First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the Hemophilia Council of California's webinar entitled Advocating for Your Child at School. This is one of a series of webinars focused on advocacy and learning to advocate for yourself that will happen for the rest of this year and then ongoing for next year. My name is Michael Bradley. I am the president of the board of the Hemophilia Council of California, and I will be your host for today. I do want to take a moment to thank Shire, Credo, and BioVeritiv for their continued sponsorship for these webinars. So as you know, that the Hemophilia Council's goal, and I just want to reiterate that, is to improve access and care and treatment through advocacy, education, and outreach for those in the bleeding disorders community within California. So our goal is to help the bleeding disorders community feel more comfortable on how to advocate for themselves. And this is just one of those series. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Buchmiller. I'm going to read a little bit about her background here. Rebecca Buchmiller dove headfirst into the world of bleeding disorders following the birth of her son in 2002 and survived the early years thanks to the amazing support provided by her local chapter. In her current position with the California Department of Social Services, she works collaboratively with complex systems in order to implement systemic reforms that benefit and protect vulnerable populations. She is a Hemophilia Council board member, and she also has a lot of experience in dealing with schools and school issues. So, Rebecca, the floor is all yours.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at lunchtime here. Mike, on my screen, I still have the advocating for the initial slide.
Okay, you want me to move it?
Yes. Can you go ahead to slide 1? Of course, it would be 3 on ours. Okay. There's your housekeeping notes. One more. There we go. So, everyone, I just want to kind of introduce myself and kind of a little bit about what we're talking about today. As Mike introduced, I have a lot of experience working with school plans in both in my personal life with my own kids and as an advocate for youth that had complex needs, for families that had children with complex mental health disorders, children in foster care and trauma and such. So over the years, I developed kind of a internal database of what to do and what not to do for parents and helping guiding them through what type of plans work best for their kids and selecting that such. And as you know, as we move forward into the new school year with the mounds of repetitive paperwork that the schools thrust on us through email or through packets that we get with emergency cards and triplicate, parents with children with bleeding disorders have the added responsibility of establishing and renewing the comprehensive healthcare plan for their child while they are at school. And today, our goal of our webinar is to provide an overview of the different types of plans that you may request or be offered to support your child in the educational setting. I think our focus today will really remain on the 2 most common plans, both what's called the 504 plan and the Individualized Education Plan, otherwise known as an IEP. There's also an individualized healthcare plan, which we'll talk a little bit about later, that's attached to either of those. So one of the questions that I receive quite often is, which one does my child need and how do I access them? So very generally speaking, the question of whether you need an IEP or 504 plan is that of a special accommodation. Does your child need something different than what is already available at the school? If the school has systems in place to meet your child's healthcare needs, then an individualized healthcare plan attached to a 504 plan might be all you need. Because most schools have systems in place to deal with taking pill forms of medication, allergies, asthma, and other more common health issues. But if your child needs modifications to their work in order to reach their full potential in the school setting, then the IEP is probably needed. So we'll get a little more into that in more detail later, but I just wanted to do the primary distinction is between the 2 plans is the need for specialized instruction. If your child needs specialized instruction, then the IEP provides for that. Next, Mike. Next slide, please.
Yeah, hold on. Doesn't seem to be wanting to do it. There you go.
Okay, here we go. So really what the paramount question that we have is, how does a bleeding disorder affect a child's performance in school? And it goes beyond just the ability to have factor and have medication at school and notifying the school that your child has a bleeding disorder. But as most parents of school-age children know, especially any with a chronic illness, attendance is one of the key factors in success for school and the performance in school. Missed school days and time really affect the child's ability to keep up with their peers and to remain at the level of instruction, keep at the level of instruction on what their aptitudes for. And really, even a bright child who misses a lot of school can suffer by falling behind and not being able to keep up with their peers. So we want to make sure that absenteeism is covered and is the critical barrier to satisfactory school importance. But we also want to make sure that we recognize that it's not just attendance, that late entries into school for infusions that go late in the morning and such are also a pretty common factor. Increased risk. Impaired access to school facilities. Access to classrooms, school facilities when mobility is an issue, either temporarily or permanently. Schools really need to make sure that our children with bleeding disorders are offered the same access to all of the programs, the buildings, the restrooms, everything at the level that meets their specific need for mobility-wise. So with our kids with bleeding disorders, we all know that at some point they're on crutches, they may be in a wheelchair, and they may have some sort of temporary or permanent mobility issue that needs to be accommodated at the school level. The other thing that I would say about access to their medication is also inherently important, especially if a refrigeration is needed. Those are other things that we need to have, because if we don't have access to medication at school, the ability to self-infuse on the campus and the timeline for getting factor to them for an infusion during a bleed also increases the risk of loss of class time. So the third bill is now the potential for increased risk of emotional, social, and/or behavioral problems. So one thing that we do know statistically is that children who suffer from any kind of acute or chronic illness are high risk for a variety of emotional and social issues, not guaranteed, but typically depression is the most common risk factor. Others are PTSD and trauma-related symptoms related to hospitalizations, chronic bleeding for our kids that have had had to have multiple surgeries and such. So those are really compounded. It's not just a bleeding disorder you're talking about there, but you're talking about the other, what they call co-occurring disorders or co-occurring diagnoses. And because our bleeding disorder population has a higher risk for that, it really needs to also be evaluated and needs to be taken into account when developing a plan for the school. Discrimination. In this day and time, we really don't have, most schools have discrimination policies as such, and our kids are protected under ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. But sometimes there's unintended discrimination where a fear of not understanding bleeding disorder can really put barriers that otherwise wouldn't be there for typical youth, such as participation in PE, field trips, recess, limiting the activities and the social engagement and the other activities that kids typically have at school. So those are some of the performance things that can happen from school performance. The kids aren't allowed to participate. They can't benefit from the learning and the engagement in those. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to start with just kind of briefly talking a little bit about the individualized healthcare plan. So all students with a bleeding disorder should have an individualized healthcare plan, and that's separate from the 504 plan and the IEP. But it is written in collaboration with the school nurse, the student, the educators, and the healthcare providers. And it really is a document that really outlines specifically the bleeding disorder and any other co-occurring disorders with a specific step-by-step plan for medication administration, storage, and kind of intervention if there needs to be on the school campus. It's really an ancillary to the 504 and the IEP and attached. So, but it's a very important document because the school nurse is heavily involved in the development of that and is on board and aware that your child has a bleeding disorder in that school. But I do want to add, it doesn't fundamentally protect the student either. So there are no legal ramifications to a school not following an individualized healthcare plan. That's why it's really important that it's not a standalone document, that it's an attachment to one of the other protections. Next slide. So an emergency care plan. Again, this is also a document that's typically attached to the individualized healthcare plan or the 504. An emergency care plan is really the one that sets a set of guidelines that provides specific directions about what to do in a particular emergency, and should include a field trip plan as well, always, any off-site activities. It can provide simple training and instructions to the non-medical personnel, the yard duties, the school secretaries, or anyone that our child typically will interact with if they had a need on the campus, until medical assistance arrives. And you should always include your treatment center and your school nurse in development. Typically, it's developed when the individualized healthcare plan is developed. You kind of do that at the same time, and you're also going to attach that to the IHP and the 504 plan or the IEP. And I apologize for all the acronyms. I understand that these acronyms can be overwhelming. Our hope is that this will be recorded and will be available on the council's website for your reference back later. But I do want to share just a little bit about this, my own personal story with the emergency care plan and the 504 plan. What I do to ensure that everybody on the school campus that's in a staff capacity really understands the need of my child on the campus and doesn't under or overreact in the event of an emergency or even a need, that I prepared an in-service training that I did with the help of my treatment center and some of my service providers. And I got material, and schools typically have a weekly or bi-weekly staff meeting. And I talked to the principal, and I'm invited to join that for about 30 minutes. And I come in and I bring snacks for the teachers, and typically your yard duties are there, your secretary. So everybody who's in some staff capacity on the campus is there. I hand out a quick sheet of kind of who my child is and what the needs are and what a bleeding disorder is. And then we kind of review the emergency care plan for my child. And I pass around a picture of him so that everybody knows, because we know that yard duty responsibility rotates with teachers in a school. We know there's high staff turnover, and we don't want an accident to happen because someone was not informed at all. And I've always found that worked really well. It was very engaging for staff. We're always very interested and engaged in the process. And it was an opportunity to educate the public about bleeding disorders. Next slide, please. So the chronic illness verification form, I'm not really sure when this started or why, but really the goal of this, it's not a legal protection or a mandatory document of any sort. It really is, I think, for the school to establish which students really have a chronic type of illness that would excuse them from participation, because we all know that seat time is important for not just for our kids, but for our schools in order to draw down funding. So, but it protects the parent, you as a parent, by having a physician complete it and say that your child does have could have intermittent issues with bleeding and miss school and might exceed the allotted number of absences. And this will protect you from getting picked up by an absence review board and brought in for a hearing of not getting your child to school, and save you the time and hassle of having to go through the process of proving yourself. One of the funny caveats to this template, and we'll have a template available as well for this, is that it does require the doctor to give the frequency and number of episodes per school year on the form. We all know that bleeding disorders, there is no way that we could ever predict that. So it takes a little explaining, but my medical personnel, my treatment center has always been very helpful in helping me explain that on the form. Next. So to briefly talk about home and hospital instruction, home and hospital is a program that's within California, it's all districts for children that are acutely ill and they cannot come to class, but still can benefit from having education. And it could be a temporary disability while a child's in the hospital, but it also might be a child that's bedridden at home with a significant bleed that really needs to be immobilized at home, but is capable of continuing on with their education. So the district has the responsibility of providing a teacher to come into the home to do the instruction so that they don't fall so far behind in school. I only recommend this when no other option exists. If students miss valuable lecture time and instructional time from the teacher, their curriculum often does not mirror what is happening in the classroom, and the teachers are limited to a very few hours a week, which leaves the parent responsible for ensuring that many of the other items are completed. Next slide. So let's talk about a little bit about the etiology of why, where do these come from and how are our children protected? Under federal law, we have what's called Free Appropriate Public Education, otherwise known as FAPE, another acronym. It's the educational right of all children, the Rehabilitation Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the difference between the two is one is that they're for kids with physical disabilities that might not have a learning need or some other type of impairment that limits their ability to participate in the school. The academic support is kind of the extra piece that we'll talk about a little bit more. In order to qualify for support under 504 or IDEA, your child must have a disability. For Section 504, this must be a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits any major life activities at a time. For parents of children with hemophilia, some important items to consider when deciding what plan will best serve your child in the educational setting are. Can I go next slide, please? So where they have a major life activity, is it? So functions such as caring for oneself, manual tasks, everything else that's listed here. One important item to note is that bleeding disorders are considered an impairment that could substantially limit a major life activity. So that applies to anyone who has a record of such impairment or is regarded as having such impairment. Next slide. So here's side by side about a 504 and an ID and under IDEA, what otherwise is what would be an IEP. So there's a Section 504 has a broad definition of the disability and what constitutes a physical or mental impairment. Many teachers see this, they see many 504s related to ADHD or ADHD. So that's a really a medical diagnosis. And IDEA, a child must establish eligibility through an assessment process, not just through a diagnosis from a doctor. So there's a whole assessment process that goes along with establishing eligibility under IDEA. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick diagram to look at the relationship of protective laws. What I really want to clarify here is a child is IDEA eligible, so they're protected by all laws. So you don't have to do a separate 504 accommodation plan and then do a full assessment to see if your child is eligible under IDEA for an IEP. They're standalone documents. If a child has qualifies under IDEA, they're automatically qualified under 504 as having a disability. Next slide, please. A couple of quick distinctions here when you're looking at the two plans. So a Section 504 plan, if a student qualifies for them, is provided with accommodations. That's the key word here, accommodations. And typically the 504 plan is short and it's really specified as for the exact type of accommodations your specific child needs in order to have access to the school and equal access. It's not legally enforceable, and it doesn't follow a child, nor their legal guidelines. A student who qualifies under IDEA will provide special education services, which includes the accommodations under a 504 and modifications, written in a detailed plan called an IEP, as we talked about before, the Individualized Education Program. An IEP is legally enforceable and has legal guidelines and timeframes and follows a student from school to school or state to state. One quick important thing to differentiate, the 504 plan, the school can initiate a 504 plan and the parent does not, and they do not have to invite the parent to the meeting. They have to notify the parent one was developed, but they don't have. Under IDA, an IEP can only be developed and with authorization from the parent. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what goes into specifically a 504 accommodation plan. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, 504 plans are shorter and less comprehensive than an IEP. They're often only a page or two and usually include accommodations, but and rarely modifications. So to further define the difference, accommodations are changes in how a student accesses information and demonstrates learning. They do not alter the instructional level, content, or lower standards or achievement. So these can be removing disability-related barriers to full participation in school, including non-academic and extracurricular activities, such as field trips, athletics, and assemblies. Accommodations are made in order to provide a student equal access to learning and equal opportunity to demonstrate what he or she knows. It should not, it should be things like access to a classroom if there's a child in a wheelchair and they need a ramp. If the doorways are not wide enough and they need modification, or they need to be accommodated in the classroom. Some of those trailer classrooms have narrow doors. They've gotten better now about doing ramps, but some of our older schools are really challenged in making sure that our kids can easily have the same accommodations. For modifications, they're changes in what a child is expected to learn. Modifications may include changes to instructional level, content, curriculum, performance criteria, and assignments. One important thing to note is with a 504 plan, that's a disability plan that that is renewed annually, and it does expire. So it's really important for parents to go in and annually and update those. Next slide, please. Talk about a little more examples for the 504 accommodations. So increased time to make up missed work. That's a real valuable one to have in your 504 plan, because we do know when there's a significant bleed, a child usually is pretty, especially when there's a lot of pain involved, there can be some time there before in the healing process where they're still suffering from some pain in some form, even if they've returned back to school. They may still have some physical limitations too until they fully resolve the bleed or they've finished their course of treatment. We want to make sure that our kids are fully able to be present in order to learn. Not counting absences or tardiness related to hemophilia against the student. Really key again, we all know that our kids with hemophilia typically have more absences or less participation in some certain subjects like PE, physical education. There's a lot more of that missed with a child with hemophilia, and we really want to make sure it's not counted against them. Additional time walking to and from class if bleeding episodes have occurred. Really important, especially when our poor kids are on crutches. I know with my son, the drop-off point was quite a ways with a line of cars at the school he went to. And, when he had a bleed, I had to have special permission to remove the cones to be able to take him all the way up front and center to drop him off near. It was important to put that into the 504 plan because the yard duty he was at any one time would have not allowed us to go drive up that way. Access to building elevators during a bleed, if they're staff-only kinds of elevators, and even staff-only restrooms that are closer to the classroom or such, or that are a little more accommodating, is something else that can be offered to children. An extra set of textbooks to keep at home to decrease the amount of weight carried to and from school. Really important. The books are so heavy nowadays. It's giving non-bleeders injuries from carrying these heavy books. Rolly backpacks help, but as we all know, our kids at a certain age are really excited about having rolly backpacks when they're in high school. So just having that as an extra set of books at home, it also helps when they have excessive absences related to bleeds. If they have a lot of bleeds, that you don't have to trek down to the school to pick up those books over and over again. Next slide, please. So tutors or home teachers are another accommodation example. Modifying the physical education plan. For my son, he was having a problem with nosebleeds in swim for whatever reason. Every time he got in the pool, he had a nosebleed, which really kind of created a little bit of a firestorm at school. So we work out in advance what he can do in place of participating, depending on whether it's a bleed and where the bleed is and whatever. And we communicate through email. Permanent pass to school nurse. If you're lucky enough to have a nurse on your school campus, which I don't think that any of my children ever had, but it might not be a permanent pass to the school nurse, but it might be also someone who acts in that capacity at the school. There usually is someone identified to get the medication for kids and such, and that person and your child develop a relationship, and so that they can go to them and they can get immediate attention from them if need so, and they can contact the district nurse and the parent at the same time. Storage of clotting factor, really important, that it's stored in a place that's easily accessible to the youth, that the staff members, that's written where it is in your IHP, your 504, as many places as you can write down where the factor is kept as possible is good. Because we all know in an emergency that's one of the main things that we need to grab. The other piece of that is to make sure that you pick it up at the end of the year. Schools do not carry medication over from one year to the next. And there have been instances where schools have thrown away a large amounts of clotting factor because at the end of the summer, they've deemed them not to be good and the parent hasn't picked it up. So they deemed it that no one wants it and they toss it out. That can be a bit of a problem. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit more about individualized education plans or an IEP. So IEP, it doesn't mean placement into special education. It means a child has been identified as having unique educational needs related to his or her disability and is entitled to an IEP to meet those needs. To be eligible, it's necessary to prove that the disability interferes with their education or performance. So children who receive special education services under ID are automatically qualified for a 504. Provides additional support. It's one of the 13 disabilities. Hemophilia is one of the 13 disabilities in the bleeding disorders, but it specifically says hemophilia in the other health impaired category in the Federal Educational Code. And that really refers to when a child has limited vitality, strength, or alertness due to a chronic or acute health problems. Now, we all know that 99% of the time that is not our youth. But what I talk to parents about when you're trying to decide between a 504 and an IEP, if your child has a severe inhibitor, if your child has had a significant bleed that has limited their ability to their mobility or their cognitive ability, even if it's for a short period of time, I would say 3 months or longer, I don't want to say too short, that you might want to consider going for an IEP. If it also covers multiple impairments such as learning disabilities. So if your child has a learning disability and hemophilia, ADHD and hemophilia, significant depression and hemophilia, any of those items, I suggest that you have them evaluated for an IEP. We'll talk a little bit more later about how to get an evaluation. And one thing to keep in mind, an IEP can be initiated at age 3 to access early intervention services. So there's things such as federally funded preschool programs, such as Head Start, physical and occupational therapy, that can be in addition to what you're already receiving through your healthcare provider as a supplement to help for kids that have had damage from bleeds. Next slide. So related services, potential areas of assistance for children with bleeding disorders. So we talked a little bit about physical therapy. That's something that can happen in the school setting. You're a child that has a significant joint damage or is in occupational or physical therapy for healing and mobility issues, that plan can be carried over and the school can implement that on the school site as well as necessary. Counseling services. This is a really important one for our kids that have bleeding disorders because of the high level of co-occurring things such as trauma from hospital stays, depression related, ADHD seems to be a common diagnosis I hear, but there's, a lot of kids have that. And schools now are federally funded under an IEP, and reminding you that we're talking about an IEP. Mental health services are available on school campuses and counseling services on an individual basis based on the need through the IEP process. So it has to go back to the qualifying condition, which will be the hemophilia or the ADHD. But if any of the symptoms are related to those diagnoses or interfering with their ability to fully receive free and appropriate education, then you can ask for those in your IEP. Extended school year for children that have missed excessive school due to bleeds and other absences related to the disability. Social work services, it's kind of a case management. Some districts will provide for complex issues with kids that have, again, co-occurring issues or more complex issues, a lot of hospital stays and such. Someone to help the parents coordinate the care, help you coordinate and access the services that you need can be really, really helpful. And then, of course, lastly, transportation. For kids that have that are in wheelchairs or whatever, having a bus come to the house to drive them, to pick them up from the home and take them to school is also something that's covered under the IDEA portion. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about the cycle of special education. And this is related to the IEP. When you're accessing an individualized healthcare plan, this is really just a nice diagram for how the process works. So obviously you have the reason for concern in your diagnosis. You're going to request an assessment, and I'll give you some samples of that later. The school is going to give you an assessment plan within 15 days, and they're going to give you a list of what they're going to assess your child in. And there's a pretty comprehensive list, and you'll be able to find that through some of the resources we give you. But it's imperative. Every child will be assessed for speech, hearing, academics, and other assorted items. That's part of under the IDEA Act. They have to be fully assessed. You have to have informed consent. So that's 15 days. So that means that you've been told, and then it takes 60 days to complete the assessment. Then you have the IEP meeting, and that's where you're going to set the goals and talk about the plan. And you're going to talk about the appropriate placement and implementation. Appropriate placement typically refers to children that have significant learning disabilities if they need to be placed in a specialized classroom rather than a child with hemophilia. But that is always part of the process. Next slide. So as your parent, what are your rights? Parents are guaranteed certain rights in the IEP process. Participate, you have a right to prior written notice. You have the right to consent. You have the right to refuse consent. If you don't believe your child needs those services, then you have the right to refuse to have them assessed. But you do have the right to have them assessed and to an independent assessment. Now, independent assessment, sometimes when you don't think that the assessments of the school does accurately reflect where your child is, your concerns, your child's concerns, your teacher's concerns, you can ask the school district to do an independent assessment. I've done that for my own child, and sometimes your local universities will do that through their school social work and school psychology programs at a reduced cost. Next slide. This is just kind of a funny little cartoon about the rights process. If you've ever been to a school meeting, you know they hand you a thick pamphlet of what your rights are and ask you to sign it pretty much immediately. I highly caution against signing your rights, acknowledging your rights quickly without having time to review them and really understand them. They are complicated, but understanding what your rights are up front will help you advocate later. Next slide, please. So prior to an IEP meeting, if you have an IEP and your child's been assessed, you want to make sure that there's sufficient time during the meeting to discuss all the issues. You want to make sure they're all IEP members are present, and you want to make sure that you're not waiving the presence of an essential team member. The school nurse is the one that I would never waive the presence of. I really believe that they need to be there so that they can really support you in communicating to the school what a bleeding disorder is, and making sure that all your concerns are identified and written into the plan. If it's not convened within legal required timelines, you do not assign an extension of time. You can request an agenda too. That's another thing that you can do to make sure that you know what's going to happen and you can prepare yourself for an IEP meeting. Next slide, please. So understanding the role of each participant. Some of the resources that we give you at the end of the slideshow will give you a little more in depth about each participant's role. Everyone who conducts an assessment needs to be present at the meeting. So if it's a speech and language person, the current teacher needs to be there, someone from the school, someone from special education. And we always want to try to be mindful of what our children, what is it that our child wants at school? How do they want to share their hemophilia, their diagnosis? Are they open? Are they not open to sharing it? What is it that they think will work best for them, and where they want to, where they should keep their factor, and who do they have a good relationship with at the school to be their point person if there's an issue? Some kids don't feel comfortable going directly to the principal. They might want to talk to someone else first. So there's all these things that we need to consider when we get to the IEP meeting beforehand to really be able to advocate for our kids. Strengths and weaknesses and are really part of the global part of the IEP. We're going to focus on strengths, always what's right, always what's going well, and always about how our children with bleeding disorders are some of the strongest, most resilient, and most kind children that you'll ever meet. We don't want to talk about what's wrong, what happens in a bleed. We don't want to focus on the weaknesses of it. It makes our children uncomfortable and feel insignificant. Next slide, please. So when you do an IEP, you're going to do annual goals. And really what we need to do is with a child with a learning disability or a reading, some sort of a processing disorder, there's going to be verbal processing or auditory processing or any of that such. We're going to set measurable goals and for 1 year. And we really want to make sure that those goals are in line with where our child is. What areas of general curriculum are affected by the disability? We want to look at the other academic or functional disability related needs to be addressed. Behavior, motor, social, emotional, communication, self-help, social, and adaptive. When my son was young, I had an IEP for him before he was able to articulate for himself when he was having a bleed, and when he and how to infuse. Before he knew how to self-infuse, and before he could articulate when he was having a bleed, I made sure that for myself, for my family, I felt more comfortable having an IEP in place for him. Is the goal measurable? And that was our measurable goal. If Bradley was having a bleed, we worked with him and the school worked with him to come to the teacher if he fell, and so he could be assessed. If he had discomfort, we worked with him on how he would approach a care provider at the school or a yard duty to ask to go and get some ice, and so that he would be able to do it. And as we progressed with that, it was not long that he was able to articulate for himself exactly what his needs were in relation to his hemophilia. Next slide. This is just a quick side-by-side again, IEP versus 504. I won't go into detail on this because it really is complicated, and I'm going to leave it on there so that you can refer back to it later. Next slide, please. So as we talked about before, advocating and educating, being prepared, coming to for either a 504 plan, have your letters from your treatment providers, have your infusion schedule, have all of your doctor's forms, your healthcare forms signed in advance if you can. Be prepared to collaborate, take notes, Know your rights. We talked about that. In-service training is always a good idea. If your treatment center will offer someone to do it or you do it yourself, highly recommend you do it every single year. There's a lot of staff turnover. And bring a support person. I can't stress this enough. IEPs aren't intended to be contentious, but sometimes, and 504 plan meetings, but sometimes there's a misunderstanding about bleeding disorders, and kids can go a full school year without having any noticeable issues. And schools can tend to minimize that, and it can put a parent on edge. And if you're automatically put on the defensive, it's really hard to articulate for yourself and advocate and get accomplished the goals you want at a meeting. There are advocates. If you have someone in your family that's a retired teacher, if you have someone in your healthcare facility or treatment center, often sometimes social workers or someone will come and they will support you during that. It could be a spouse. And it can be a hired advocate. There's special education advocates that help parents on an individual basis developing these plans and preparing for these meetings. Next one. So I'm talking a little bit about confrontation. These are all just basic kinds of things that you would do in any kind of a situation where you had to come to a team conclusion where you may not always agree in the beginning. But using I and we statements, asking, to understand, those are the things. And one thing I always do is come from a place of curiosity. I wonder why that is, or can you tell me more about your observation or how that was administered? I had a PE teacher that didn't want my son to do any of the sports activities for the year. Her eyes were as big as saucers just as soon as the word hemophilia came out of our mouth. And she tried to write it into the plan in front of me, even though the doctor's letter very clearly outlined what it was that he was and was not allowed to do. And through some careful questioning and helping her understand through gentle kind of questioning and inquiry, I was able to come to an agreement with her where he would and wouldn't play it at 13, and that he really was responsible for letting someone know when he wasn't able to participate, and if it became a problem, we could revisit it. So next slide, please. Funny thing is, talking about control, don't forget your angry eyes. We have the IEP meeting today. You know how they're always frightened by them. If anyone's been to IEPs, they're kind of a scary thing for parents, and parents that feel like their children's needs aren't being met. We've got to be very mindful of our body language and eyes, and putting others on the defensive as well. They all have a job to do as well. So team points, I thought it was cute. So we talk, next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about roadblock statements. And these are kind of typical statements that you'll come to, whether it's a 504 plan or an IEP meeting. If the school, unfortunately, they're not supposed to, but many times they will pre-meet, especially now in the day of email, and come up with kind of a plan of what they are and are willing to do for your child in the school setting. And so these are some of the statements that you will hear from them in order to dissuade you from pursuing and advocating further to get what you have asked for. So like we talked about, your child hasn't had a bleeding episode yet. Let's reconvene and write a plan if that changes. Absolutely not. Our child has a diagnosed disability. They absolutely need an IEP, and they need a plan in place for when it happens. It's not if, it's when. If they're doing fine academically, they don't require a 504 IEP. Our children that are doing well academically, if they miss a lot of school, they may not be doing well academically. If they get a concussion, if they have a bleeding disorder and a concussion, they will not be able to keep up academically. These all need to be written into the plan as if. It's a plan for a reason. It's a plan for. Some of the other things they can try to do is limit the time of the meeting, saying the teachers can do goals and accommodations or modifications. They don't need an aid or support. And addressing the student, putting the pressure on the student. You need to ask for help when. It's appropriate in the context of a bleeding disorder for a child, obviously, to be able to identify that they have a bleed going on or something that they need to be able to access for help. But it's not okay for the teachers to ignore any of the other plans and only leave it on the child. They need to be able to recognize when a child isn't straightening their arm out, especially young children, in the classroom, or they're limping a little. They need to do inquiry as well. Next statement, please. So another long list of these, I want to be mindful of time. So I want to go through that. These will all be on the website. These are all kinds of typical stated roadblock statements you'll get from the school. Next slide. One here that I really want to concentrate with is we don't let students with IEPs or 504 plans participate in these programs, track, band, gate, etc. Our kids are totally protected under 504 and the IDEA, and they cannot be excluded from any program that receives federal funding. Now, that also includes after-school programs on the school campus. If they receive federal dollars, they have to accommodate under the IEP and the 504. Important distinction. Next slide, please. So before you leave a meeting, get a written offer of faith. If there's an eligibility determination meeting, then agree to the eligibility. Even if you haven't worked out all the details, even if you're not completely happy with everything that they've offered to support your child in the school setting, get your eligibility first, and then you can come back and ask for an IEP every 30 days if you need to keep readdressing if your child's not being fully supported or they're not making progress. So that's important. Next slide, please. So how to resolve disputes. The IDEA gives parents several specific ways to resolve disputes. It's usually in this order: mediation, due process, resolution, civil lawsuit, state complaint, and lawsuit. Typically, they don't go this far. But if you get to the point where you need to have it, you're having a dispute and you don't seem to get anywhere, I do encourage families to reach out to an advocate, a special education advocate, and we'll have some resources at the end of the slide, and file with them and have them mediate on your behalf. It always works wonders. Only one time have I had one go further than a mediation. Next slide, please. Documenting. This is the rule of thumb. If it was never written, it was never said, and it will never be done. No matter what promises are made for you during the IEP's annual goal writing or during a dispute, if it's not documented and you don't have it in writing, it didn't happen, and you have nothing to go back on if you move forward with a state fair hearing or another type of resolution or civil hearing resolution hearing to move forward. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So I really encourage parents to keep a notebook and write down every conversation that you have, email, preferably by email with a read receipt attached. That's always a nice way to do it as well. Next slide. Section 504 disputes are a little bit different. They still have some protections in place. They have to be related to access and based on the disability. Quick story about my own daughter. Had a concussion outside of school in soccer. The doctor was pretty significant, and she's a carrier for bleeding disorder, so she had some extra problems, with healing and time frames. The concussion specialist wrote a 504 plan for her to give to the school. The school refused to honor it. And told her that she had to participate. She could either be on home and hospital or that she would have to come to school. And for example, every day of not participating in PE, she would have to run 1 mile. She was out of PE for 40 days. That would have been 40 miles that she would have had to run to make up, to keep her grade at an A, which is where it was, because she was an athlete. She was in geometry at the time, very complex class for her. She had a tutor she was going through. The doctor said no sustained mental activity, 30 days. She wasn't going to make it to that class. I asked them to drop her and re-enroll her the next semester as part of the 504. Absolutely not. The doctor, I ended up having to go through these process, and we got to the complaint to the Office of Civil Rights. At the same time, I had filed for an impartial hearing with an attorney. And luckily, through the dispute resolution through the attorney's office in conjunction with the school district attorney, they realized they were completely out of compliance. And they came back and they removed the negative marks from my daughter's school record, which, considering she was a junior in high school, was really important that her cumulative record did not show these absences and fails, and everything is not being related to a 504. So I can say that it's very helpful to always document everything and engage others when you need to move forward to dispute. Next slide. So talking a little bit about our resources, these will all be available with links. I highly recommend all of these publications, easy to print out. The Federation of America has great videos. National Hemophilia Foundation has wonderful publications related to bleeding disorders specifically. Rights Law has ongoing presentations and updates on their website, and understood.org also has. And in addition, you should have received some sample templates from us on how to ask for an IEP or 504 plan. It's really important that you drop a letter in writing to the school initiating the request for an assessment or for a 504. And I highly recommend that you bring 2 or 3 copies. Ask the school to date stamp them. And we talked about writing, if it wasn't written, it wasn't done. Date stamp those. Send 1 to your district special ed coordinator, 1 stays with the school, and 1 is for your records. That starts that legal time clock ticking. Sample letter will be, should have been sent out with a link today, individualized healthcare plans. And I also sent you a template for a 504 plan for a child with a bleeding disorder that I've used for my own son. It's not for every child, but it's a good jumping off point to take a look at and to kind of think about some things that might be outside the box that you maybe haven't occurred yet, that you can feel free to take those and replicate those with your school as well. Any other questions?
So Rebecca, first of all, thank you. That was absolutely terrific. So far, there was no questions on the chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the lines for anyone, because everyone's muted, Rebecca. That's why no one's getting back to you. I'm going to open up the lines.
Okay.
Now. So if anyone has a question, we have 5 minutes that Rebecca can answer them. If they're more intricate questions, then feel free to send it to the Hemophilia Council. So I'm going to unmute everyone right now. All right. Does anyone have any questions for Rebecca?
Hi, my name is Vicky. I have a question. My daughter has an IEP, and they also told me that she can qualify for the 504 plan, but they didn't want it to add it. Is it better the IEP than the 504?
So does the IEP does it have the individualized healthcare plan in it and the emergency care plan related to her bleeding disorder?
No, I took a letter from the doctor, but she has a special education.
So what I would recommend is that you reach out to her special, because a 504 plan is automatically part of an IEP, right? The medical part, but what is the IEP for? Is it for learning?
Yeah, special learning.
Okay, for special learning. So what you need to do is you need to request I recommend that you request an IEP. That you need to go back, even if you had one within the last year, because you have one annually to update it, but you can request one when the needs change at any time. So what you can do now is you drop a letter at the school on the first day of school requesting an IEP due to changes in circumstances with your daughter, and then give them the doctor's letter then, and then open that. And then when you sit down with the IEP team again, they're going to add in the bleeding disorder information into the IEP.
Okay, what about she already graduated from high school? She's going to be to an adult school?
Now, okay, so now for an adult school, that you're right, the learning part won't follow her. What will follow her is the 504 plan, and that's the accommodations for her on the college campus. That's an important distinction to make. Our children, as they go on to college, they still are protected under ADA and the 504 plan. They can carry that. The specialized learning instruction doesn't necessarily follow them into college after age, but you would. So I would talk with the Adult Learning Center, and if they don't comply, there's the disability rights California is a link on this website here. They also will take up your case so you can file with them if the school is non-responsive.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's a lot of great information here. I know there's a couple links. Rebecca, I want to thank you again for an outstanding presentation. I think all of us learned a whole lot on this. I thank you all for taking the time in the middle of the day for this important learning event, and please feel free to sign up for our other webinars as are posted on our website. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.